Well, we're really honored and privileged to have Volker Wieland back to Stanford, his old stomping ground, so to speak. You've been around the world doing many other things since then, so including the Council of Experts in Germany, 9 years, right?
Right.
The Third University now in Frankfurt, director of the Institute of Monetary and Financial Studies. That's pretty impressive. Director of anything. and continuing the research. It's phenomenal. Welcome to talk today about this Russia-Ukraine war, inflation and recession, Quo Vadis, Germany, and EU. What a title! So thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for joining us for this exchange. It's always great to be back here. I hope people online can also understand me well. And so this time, this is not going to be a talk about macroeconomic modeling, although we've organized a lot of these, right? So we have built a database of macro models, macro financial models, macro epidemic models. Now we're in the next crisis in Europe, or overall an energy crisis. So we also need some macro energy models. Now, a lot of models have macro in oil, but as you'll see throughout my talk, which will be mainly a talk about current developments, actually we need a much better understanding also how limitations such as pipelines and things like that affect things. So as I said, a current analysis talk, very much related to the kind of topics we analyzed when I was in the the Council of Economic Experts, the German version of the CEA, which I participated in until end of April this year for 9 years. And there are three topics or three elements I want to talk about. I mean, this could keep us going for 3 hours, but so I have a selection. I'll start with Russia-Ukraine war and the energy crisis from a German perspective in particular. So I'm not going to cover everything in Europe, but some comparisons from a German perspective. This has been a big source of inflation. It's not the only source, and inflation needs to be accommodated to happen. So there is some accommodation by the central banks, of course. But so inflation, and we're now actually heading into recession in Germany in particular, probably in Europe overall. What's happening there? What's the outlook? And concluding with policy challenges, what is to be done and what is likely to be happen. There are many aspects of that. So I've talked with various people here already, many questions. I will only be covering some aspects of the policy challenges. In particular, I'll talk a little bit about the multi-policy, very briefly about the government's fiscal, but mostly the energy side, because that's the key element of the crisis. So there should be a key element of policy addressed to that. Okay, so here, this was just, let's start with the war. The Russia-Ukraine war meant big changes in Germany too. With many people, it was a shock. I mean, I went to high school during the end of the Cold War, and we still had a military service, a draft service. So we had a big peace movement at the time, which is now non-existent. But basically, so from that perspective, not everything seems so new, right? So that was a time when there was a threat, whether it's a conviction that one has to defend Europe, defend Germany, or defend Western Europe, and we had capabilities to do so. Now we find we don't have them. In Germany, that made a big change in policy, and it was called, they coined the term Zeitenwende, change of times. So just a few words on what that means. One of the things it meant, I mean, you saw here the recent positive news from Ukraine that Ukraine can actually recapture territory. You see on this map, the violet, what was regained by Ukraine. And in this context, also German weapons played a small role, not a big role, but for Germany it was a huge change to actually start supplying weapons to war zones. So just just one of the colleagues from the military here. So these are German air defense tanks, artillery, rocket launchers. So apparently, they made also a small difference in these counterattacks. So that's a totally new. You might say, well, what's the big deal? I mean, there was the big support for Ukraine came from UK, from the US, of course, not so much from Europe. A lot now recently from Eastern Europe, but for Germany itself, it's a big change. Why? We long held the belief and had the practice that, given our history, given the experience, starting World War II, losing World War II, no war should be starting from German ground. And there was a strong insistence not to provide German weapons, not even via third countries in the conflict zones. So you have very complicated, say you have sold Leopard now, there's a big discussion about tanks. These things look like tanks to people who don't know, like myself, but there are different types of tanks, and I either want the Leopard or the Marder or other tanks to transport troops. And so even that means when a country such as Spain or Poland has bought them from Germany, they first have to get approval from Germany to sell it on or to pass it on. So, but that's one of the big change. There was also a strong support for sending troops from the Bundeswehr to Eastern European NATO countries. So these are things which already happened within a few days after the start of war. Right? Maybe also with a lot with influence from the allies, such as the US. Of course, we're not behind the scenes, but probably there were some active conversations between leaders. But there was strong support for sending troops, but quickly it became clear that we lacked the capability in terms of armed forces. Even the general in charge of the whole army German forces administration said, "Well, we're not capable to supply much." So that in public, he said that in public. So that was for the minister that that was a bit of a shock, also because she had no experience regarding defense. She was previously State Secretary in Finance. Anyway, so you can see it's not been a primary focus, but there was also a strong support for economic sanctions, risking a cutoff of Russian energy supplies. But there was opposition. There was a decision not to go for an immediate embargo, which was a discussion in March. What was the plan on defense? To rebuild a very capable, highly modernized and advanced forces that we can actually rely on to protect, help in the protection. So that will be taking quite some time. There's a special financing vehicle which is outside of any constitutional fiscal rules. So there is funding available, but you actually have to build it up. So that will be a big challenge. In terms of energy security, the decision was, let's achieve independence from Russian energy imports. For example, build more renewables, import LNG, do other measures. Easier said than done. So that will be a key focus of my talk. On defense, one thing also to consider, it's not just equipment, right? Say what's completely natural for a country such as the United States, that you send troops, that people serve, and that they are considered heroes, or that's a very positive image that if you put your life at risk, we don't have much. If you look around in the German government, basically all the male ministers up to the chancellor are people who objected. So we have the possibility to object military service. When there was a military service, we had the possibility to object for reasons of conscience, which all of them did. The only one who later on became a reserve officer was the finance minister, Lindner, because when he objected, this was more because he was running a company. So he did do service later on, but basically in the leadership, you have nobody with direct experience of military service or create. I think one challenge which is underestimated, creating the idea that people should, very qualified people, should with lots of options should serve in the army and the defense forces. It's going to be a challenge. I have just a little anecdote. I have among our relatives a young woman who joined the military recently in basic training. She told me basically from her group, it dwindled within a time. It dwindled down to a little more than 10%. So it's hard. It's hard to go. There was a question.
Now, Volker, you referred to this objection as a conscientious objection, but I don't think that's a good analog. My understanding from talking with my German friends is that you had a choice between military service or service in non-military activities.
Yeah, no, it didn't.
Whereas in conscientious objector means, well, was a much different, more difficult process here.
Yeah, but when I so
Okay, there's many generations, yeah.
So my generation, and this is same generation as the people now in leadership, you actually could only do the civil service after you convincingly argued
Oh, you did have
that it is for reasons of conscience. It was not just a choice and you choose. They are now debating whether we reintroduce that kind of service as a choice, and then simply if you think of an army for territorial defense, you need many more people. I mean, you know, Finland just joined NATO. Finland is a population of 5 million. They also have an army up to 90,000, and they can bring up to close to 1 million of people if everyone. So but there's an idea of everyone serves. So that's a.
Now, your comment on the German military is very depressing because, first of all, the German military was a very strong force during the Cold War. It was and the American forces, and I think British also, they were the anchor of NATO's presence and the defense of, and those were the troops that were in the Fulda Gap, which is where the serious fight was fighting going to be. Now you're saying that just in a matter of less than 30 years, this is all fallen apart. Now,
well, they changed strategy. They have a professional army. It was a professional army to do small missions abroad.
yeah.
And even that, you know, the capability is limited. But I don't want to make that the main part of my talk.
Okay.
I just want to, I have basically three things. You know, we have a position of weakness on the defense side. We have a position of weakness on the energy security side. And on the economic side, we're certainly not as strong as we seem to think. So I think all three need to be addressed, and I'll talk more about the others. But I wanted to say military is not that easy. It's not just, I think it's feasible, but it really needs a change of thinking, and we would need political leaders who can credibly do that. So that will be a challenge. That's the kind of little thought I wanted to leave with you. But going to energy security, so we've seen here, this is from last week, the current oil and gas prices in this crisis. Yellow here is the US price for gas, which you buy natural gas in the US. So that hasn't changed that much. It has risen, but not, you know, as you can see, not that big. The green is basically the European price, the Dutch price, which is European price for natural gas supplied by pipeline, and the LNG price is the same, which also means if you would look at prices for Asia, the LNG price for Asia is also similar. So this is many multiples. This is spot price, so it varies a lot. Most gas usage is by longer term contract. So a lot of people don't see that spot price yet. Some feel it so strongly, like Uniper. You may have read about that. The largest company supplying gas to the households, which now has to be nationalized, but which depends, that one is completely dependent on Russian gas. And you see from this also the futures for next year, so it's perceived to stay high, and I would venture to guess that also after 2023, we're going to have high prices for a while. And this is a major change in the competitive situation, of course. The blue line is the Brent oil price. That's the North Sea oil price. That's not very different from West Texas Intermediate. So that's a world phenomenon. But the oil prices are coming down again. But the big difference, say, between a competitive position, if you're thinking of investment in industry, between Europe and, say, US, Canada, is the natural gas price. On this side, you can see the pipelines. And as we've just learned, I'm going to have a lot of current stuff. As we've just learned, there are a lot of strategic issues about that. So these, of course, first I had a chart with just the Russian lines coming here from the east. They are mostly stopped, not all of them, but certainly in the North Sea one, which you can see there. The Nord Stream one, which is which is in the East Sea, right? The blue one there. And we just found out, here's a bigger picture from the area around the island of Bornholm, beautiful island. I've never been there, but from I've heard, the beautiful Danish island here between Sweden and Germany and Poland. And right off that are these three leaks, right? It looks pretty shocking. This is where the gas is coming out, and basically the whole pipeline has to empty. It's about 100 million cubic meters, I just read today. By the world of methane, which is 80 times as effective as than CO2 in affecting the atmosphere, so it's 80 times worse. But there's much of which can be done about that. But the world methane emission is, of course, much more. So relative to that, it's not that big.
In fact, it lasts that long. So is there any concern that people who supply gas under these fixed price contracts, do they all have a supply of gas to do it? Or, I mean, if you're short the spot and long the contract
Yeah, exactly. So you have different companies. You have some companies maybe which got gas from Norway. And if they have a long-term contract with Norway, then they are getting the same price as before. So they don't experience, so they're in a good position. Then you have companies such as Uniper, which used to get it from Russia, and now has to buy Norwegian gas or Dutch gas at the spot price, which is why Uniper basically folded. And throughout the economy, many households, firms, you have the same problem. Some face it, some not, right? So, but before we get into that, there's a strategic consideration. If you think about that, so if you look back to this map, so now there's rumors or discussion that this cannot be just an accident. Maybe it was sabotage. Who knows who? If it were sabotage, well, we're now relying on Norway. You can see the gray line there. I don't know if you can see it very well, but the gray line to Norway. What if there would be an attack on the Norwegian guys?
Just before I came, there's rumors of drones, unknown drones flying around the Norwegian.
Yeah, I've read about that too. So basically, you see, energy security is a pretty broad topic. Now, there are also pipelines we have increased supply from Norway. In Italy, Mario Draghi was traveling to Algeria, and they're getting more gas from Algeria, but it's also an undersea pipeline. So this is something maybe last week I hadn't thought about, right? Or maybe a lot of people haven't thought about, but there are some serious security issues. The importance, if you want to look at the importance of Russian gas, it's pretty important. I mean, if you look in past years, the orange here, this is in terms of billions of cubic meters, is the Russian gas. The blue is the rest. This is for the EU 27. And for comparison, the green is the existing LNG imports, past LNG imports of Europe, right? So there's a lot of liquefied natural gas coming in, but it's less than the Russian imports. That's what's coming in. So the total world trade in LNG is the blue diamond, the light blue diamond on top. So you can see pretty easily it's not going to be the simple solution. So certainly not in the near term. LNG production would have to be increased massively to make up for that. In Germany, it was about 55% of the gas imported from Russia, and also 50% of the hard coal and 30% of the oil. Coal and oil is easier to basically source from elsewhere by tanker than gas. In terms of, I think it's important in terms of energy use, and this is similar if you look at Europe overall. But if you look at Germany, this is basically the complete consumption of primary energy, not just for electricity, for power, but also for mobility, for heating, for industry. And you can see that it has declined, right? So we've been in the whole process trying to achieve our climate goals. We've been reducing, but it's not that big, and if you see at the right end, there's some red dots, which are targets for the future. There's a massive target. You're laughing. I don't know. One could also cry. I've actually decided, since I'm very concerned, not to make any jokes. So in this talk, but yeah, so this is the plan. Well, now you can see
those climate targets or strategic targets. Whose targets are those?
These are climate-related targets.
They were planning to cut overall energy usage in half?
Well, not quite in half. But you see, we have growth with less energy. So we had economic growth with less energy. That's possible.
We see that I didn't see the tiny numbers in the x-axis. That's
2050.
Yeah, so this is 2050. So we have time.
Promises about existing.
Yeah, but anyway, just to put it in perspective, And you see the green is the renewables that has increasing. But if you look at, a lot of people talk about renewables in terms of electricity. And on average, renewables make now a big share of electricity. Very variable, but big. But the thing is, we have large segments, basically heating and mobility and industrial use, which are other uses of energy. And so looking at primary energy consumption, renewables are still very small. So the transition is still ahead. And you can see blue is oil and yellow is gas, both playing a huge role, right?
Why has nuclear come down?
Well, because we decided to exit nuclear. This is an important thing. So I said the peace movement seems to be gone. They're not present in the current discussion. In fact, the Green Party, which came out of the Green Peace movement and the anti-nuclear movement and the environmental movement, they are basically now the strongest in terms of advocating to sending weapons, sending tanks to Ukraine. But in terms of nuclear movement, that's still strong, because we're now debating turning off the last remaining nuclear power stations. So you see here, nuclear has dwindled. In 2021, we still had 6 plants. 3 of them were shut down in December 2021, just in time for the war. And the other 3 are still planned to be shut down in December. There is now, just yesterday was some news, maybe it's going to change. But for now, the idea was to shut them down and to keep 2 around. So to bring them back, which is a pretty silly thing to do, because nuclear is either on or off. It's not the kind of thing you can turn on and off all the time. There was a question?
You pretty much answered it. I was going to ask what the scope was to actually renew nuclear supply back to where it was in the 2004 or 5.
Well,
it seems to me in an emergency like this, that would be a logical way to do it.
Yeah, you would think that's a no-brainer. So the possibility is basically 6 power plants, which is exactly the magenta in 2021. That's the 6 maximum we can have right now. Well, you might say, well, we can do without it, but it means still a significant additional savings one needs to do. How is the gas used? Maybe let me, just so I get to the other points, I kind of run through this part, and then we go into inflation. So how is the natural gas used? Here I show it for Germany. Basically, 30% is used for household heating. So most of us, I heat with natural gas. Most people heat with natural gas. Then there's some here, trade commerce, that's probably also mostly heating. There's something called district heating, that's the red. So light blue, green, that's all heating. Orange is power supply, 13% here. So 13% in principle you could take out by not using gas power stations. You cannot shut them all off, unfortunately, but you can shut some of them off. And the rest is basically 30%, 37% of industry. So some of that is heating, but the large part is basically for production, or for steel production, iron production, fertilizer, ammonia. That's a big share of the chemical industry. So that's where most of the savings can come from. We have already saved about 20%. Over the summer, usage has gone down by 20% to the 5-year average, mostly because industry has stopped using it. Those people who face the high prices, those companies who are paying spot prices, of course, are eagerly trying to look for alternatives or to just move production elsewhere. For 2 reasons. Basically, because we did not go for an embargo. We still got quite a bit of Russian gas over the spring and summer via the pipelines until they were shut off. And also because the industry reduced production, we could actually run up natural gas storage. Natural gas is mostly used in the winter. 85% of household usage is for heating in the winter. So you basically store it over the summer. So it's piped in all year. You store it over the summer and then use it in the winter. So that's the situation. So the good thing is storage is now 90%. Now, as you can see here, there's also Gazprom storage. And you might ask, say, well, why didn't you worry about this? What did you? There were actually moments when you could have worried. So if you look at the yellow line here, Gazprom didn't fill its storage tank in 2021. and it was in the news. And when I was still a member of the German Council, we also had meetings with government officials, and I did ask Angela Merkel in November 2021 whether we should worry. It was a private meeting, so I cannot tell you the answer, but you can you can probably guess what the answer was. Anyway, not to worry, probably. But this is the situation there. Now, before I go into the next point, I just wanted to mention, so I was still in this German CA in spring, and after the war, we looked at this and we had an update of our forecast. I'll show you the number later because it'll be interesting to see the revision. And we had a meeting with government officials, with the Chancellor, with Minister Habeck from the economy portfolio, from the Greens, Lindner from the Free Democrats, Finance, the Labor, the Minister for Labor and Social Affairs, Health. And so we had an opportunity to make a point. At the time, there was a heated discussion about whether we should do an embargo or not. And you may have read some also papers from economists who advocated that this would be not a big deal economically wise. We could substitute and would maybe change the development.
Oh, thanks for calling back. How are you doing?
Boskin.
Good, how are you?
I haven't found the mute button yet.
Okay, so that's that was the meeting, and we basically said, okay, we didn't get into that discussion. We said, look, you have to basically be prepared for Putin. This was on March 30th. You have to be prepared for Putin shutting that off the deliveries at a time when it's suitable for him in the conflict. It's probably not at the time. Still, some people thought it will be a short conflict, but we basically thought it's going to be a longer term conflict. So our recommendation was use all possibilities to basically keep up the supply of energy. So one of the things, Nick, I mean, your question, one of the things we said, and we're people with different views on a lot of economic issues, but on that we were all had a unanimous opinion. So we said, let's continue the use of the 6 nuclear power plants. Let's let prices have to work so that we actually get to really reduce consumption of energy, and let's use all other options. For example, increase coal, get gas out of electricity production, and whatever other options you can have. So at the time, the government actually was even more pessimistic than we were about the impact of an embargo or of a delivery stop. But as you can imagine from the current discussion, they did not use all the opportunities you have to enhance the energy supply. And that has impact on inflation and recession.
On this point of feeling, for instance, if I've got a long-term, I'm the beneficiary of a long-term contract, say I have a steel mill, is it possible for me to just sort of shut down my steel and sell my gas on the spot market? I want everyone to feel the marginal incentive. So do they have to, well, I got it, I have to use it on the steel? Can I instead, resell it on the spot market and that would run close rates?
I can't. There are probably some legal issues there, but I think in principle you can, but it may depend on exactly what your contract says, right? Because if you're just the steel producer and the company who delivers the gas, you cannot sell the gas just without, the company has to redirect the gas.
Well, you could tell the company, hey, you gave me this long-term contract, here's the deal.
Yeah, you would have to, that's my point. They might want to make a deal with you. So whether it's
but the difficulty of getting everyone to feel the prices, making sure that happens would be a great way to get everyone to feel the prices.
Yeah, well, you could, they are choosing different ways, but I think in this case it's not so clear how the incentives will be, because the steel producer might not be able to get a big share in that deal, right? On the other hand, there is a possibility that the government says in an emergency the contracts are not valid anymore. Right? So that's another thing. These are different. We can go into the details of the measures, but let me maybe tell the whole story, draw the narrative, and come back to these.
Volker,
clearly, you're not going to achieve the savings.
Volker, one quick question. Sorry, I popped on off. You've already covered this. What are the opportunities for for trading supplies across countries?
The opportunities are limited. I mean, they are there. I mean, oil is easier because you can send tankers. In terms of gas, there is the liquefied natural gas, which you can trade. Basically, we can pay a lot of money so that, for example, think of countries such as Japan or Korea. Maybe they have options, and they are in this business too. I mean, they may find it easier to say, okay, we forgo and send it to Germany, but we get some of the high price because they have to, say, if Qatar or if some other country wants to send LNG to Germany, then their contract with an Asian country might have to be changed, right? So, but the problem is you need a facility, a terminal, which Germany doesn't have.
Yeah,
And
you need
we have lots of terminals in France and Spain, but then the pipelines are not built to they're not thick enough to transport gas from west to east. So in that sense, it's quite limited. That's what I meant in terms of modeling the effect of energy on the macroeconomy. That's the kind of problems which usually, we just have the price in there. So let me.
Okay, is it possible? Are there multiple pipelines and one of them could be reversed and go west to east instead of east to west?
Well, you can. I mean, the pipelines get thinner, right? So the pipelines go from Russia to Germany, and then maybe there is something transported on, but the flows from Germany to Spain are small, right? So you can say, okay, let's send things from Spain to Germany, but the thickness is not big because it wasn't built for that. So we have to get our own LNG terminals, and we're going to have 2 mobile ones. That's about it. And maybe in January, that's going to be a little bit of supply. And our leaders are traveling around the world and begging for it, but it's not that easy. Maybe
Volker, sorry, if I may chime in. This is Elena Pastorina, I'm a Hoover research fellow, currently at the Minneapolis Fed. I wanted to touch upon a point that you raised earlier about the continuity of supply. So the Italian government, our current prime minister for another few weeks, Mario Draghi, I think was one of the first to understand that the conflict would have lasted in Ukraine much longer than initially expected, and worry early on about engaging in some footwork and going to Algeria first person. How do you think it has been badly miscalculated, the length of the war, and how Germany and other countries like Italy are prepared for the longer haul, and how solid is their resolve against a situation that may be worsening and may be lasting a lot longer than everybody expected?
Maybe I'm going to say a few more things about that in the third segment, but briefly, I think there's a lot of focus now really on the near term, on the winter, and I think that's only part of the picture. And the main thing you can do for the winter is just to reduce consumption, unfortunately. And there isn't that much more supply one can get. The other problem is really the medium term. How is growth? How is industry being affected in Europe? Where are they going to invest? Is energy going to stay expensive? I think that should be much more of a focus, and they're not doing enough in that area. But that will be my concluding remarks, so I'll come to that. Now, inflation and recession. I mean, energy prices have risen inflation, and Christine Lagarde just had a speech at a conference yesterday where she said inflation is very different in Europe than in the US because it's supply driven and not demand driven, and that's why they cannot raise interest rates as much. More or less was the implication, I think. But I think inflation is inflation. Of course, both sources are active, and whether supply drops below demand or demand is raised above supply, it's a similar problem. It's a gap. But of course, the shocks are different, and it's been very energy driven. If you look here at the consumer prices, it's 9.1% inflation in August. If you look at core, or inflation without energy, it's 5.8. If you would look at the GDP deflator, which I'm not showing here, but it's also in the range, because we don't produce much oil and gas in Europe. We produce some, but the GDP deflator is going to be close to core or to consumer inflation without energy. The rates vary dramatically. I mean, in the euro area, 9%. In the EU as a whole, it's 10% now in August. But the range goes from 6.6 in France, so they're maybe a little bit more relaxed there for now, to 25% in Estonia. I mean, it's unbelievable if your income is reduced in terms of purchasing power by a quarter within a year. I mean,
why is Estonia a little bit so high?
Probably because, I mean, I haven't looked at it in detail, but one factor is that they completely depend in terms of energy, maybe on Russia. I mean, they also have LNG plant. The Baltics build LNG terminals, so they can be supplied, but at the world price. And maybe there are other reasons, right? But that's one of them. It's not just raw materials. I think this survey is interesting. This is a survey of industry on the left, where basically you can see what companies complain about. The EU collects that. And so what do they complain about? Energy has been one. So blue is raw materials and intermediate products. So that's both energy and intermediate products. That's been a big concern. It still is a big concern. It's coming down a little. But even if we're in recession now, you don't see it that there is an excess supply of raw material and intermediate products. Also, labor supply is the second largest. So even if we're in a recession, we're still far away from a situation where there's excess labor available. So I wouldn't expect unemployment to rise very quickly. In services, it's even more explicit. We had a resurgence of tourism, for example, in Southern Europe, other areas of services. So labor supply is the biggest concern. So these factors, of course, mean that when core inflation is high, pressure to raise wages is high. So we'll have sustained inflation. You can see that here, if you look at medium-term inflation expectations for the euro area, that's a blue line. It's now actually, this is expectation from financial markets for the next 3 years. It's now above the US, right? The US at 3% here for 3 years, euro area a little bit higher, and UK, of course, even higher. Now, where does Germany stand in terms of the economy? I think that relates to also to some of the questions. And see, into my third point, you know, I said in terms of economic strength, we're not as strong as we seem to think. So, John, we talked yesterday, and he said, well, Germany was doing pretty well, right? Yes. If you look at the big dip here in Q2 2020, in the pandemic, Germany declined less than the rest of Europe. I'm comparing it here to France and Italy. In the initial data, it declined even less. GDP declined less than in the US. I mean, now with the revisions, it's about the same. But you can see that in terms of the growth since 2020, Germany has been the slowest in Europe, except for Spain. But so we're falling in the level of GDP, we're falling already a bit behind Italy and France, even though we're much, much more strongly affected by the pandemic. It is basically a map which shows you in red the countries with the least growth. So we have stagnation, meaning we're just now at the level of 2019. We're basically at the point pre-crisis. That's what we reached in the first half of the year. And if you look at industry, which is going to be very affected by these energy problems, industry has been weak for a while. I mean, here the blue line industry from 2018. And here I put all the countries at 100 in 2018, right? So this shows you the growth from 2018. And you can see that the industrial production index, so this is an index, in Germany is still below 2018, and it's actually been falling behind here, the US, France, and Italy. And then, of course, the share of industry in Germany is bigger in GDP. It's about 23%. I think in the US, it's 19%. So US here is green, blue is Germany.
So what do you attribute the shortfall in German performance for the hike in energy prices?
Well, already in 2018, we had kind of an industry recession. There were a number of factors, but for example, we had a drought. So the chemical industry was down because supplies couldn't be shipped up the Rhine. That was one of the arguments or one of the factors, but there are other factors. which were holding back industry at the time. And then in the pandemic, I think, well, we closed initially a lot of industry, but the main reason why it didn't recover well is the high cost of intermediate products. So, they complain about IT chips and other things. So industry has, so cars were sold, but less, even at a higher price, but less. And so that's a big factor. But now it's the energy, and you can see the prospect is not good for those who are high in energy. So that's my last slide on the second point. We have basically stagnation now. Inflation has eaten up the savings from the Corona crisis. So we had a lot of savings because we couldn't travel. Germans like to travel, but they're eaten up by inflation. A lot of companies, let me just jump through that, but you can imagine that already now there's survey data that a lot of companies are saying we're reducing production or we're locating production elsewhere. So those surveys are already ancient history because the outlook is getting more pessimistic. So in terms of forecasts, I think that's interesting. So in March 30th, we predicted 1.8% GDP growth in Germany for this year and 3.6 next year. The idea was, well, it will resume. Now, what are the forecasts now? There are a lot of forecasts coming now in September. I'm showing you different institutes. This Institute of World Economy in Kiel is down to 1.4 and minus 0.7 for next year. This institute from Munich, IFO Institute, they're down to 1.6 and minus 0.3 next year. DK Bank, which is a bank related to the Sparkassen, they're down to minus 1.6 next year. Deutsche Bank just sent around a newsletter, is down to minus 3.5 next year. So these things are really dropping. Now, of course, uncertainty is huge and can't assign much to these numbers, but you can see that it's not very likely that it's just a minor
What
event.
is the main explanation, say, for these negatives?
The main explanation is we have the complete stop of gas deliveries, and we have the realization, basically, that we're ending up with longer-term high cost of energy. But basically, the war is longer, prices have risen, and they're expected to stay high for longer. That's the main news, right?
At some point you said go way down.
The gas consumption is down 20% relative to but that's mostly industry savings. But you have to remember, gas consumption mostly happens in the winter. So if you're down 20% in the summer, it doesn't mean you're going to be down 20% in the winter. I mean, you need a lot of hard work. Okay, so that's this point. So my final point, and that comes back to some of these questions, is basically what needs to be done and what is likely to be done. And there's lots of issues. I just cover some, and then maybe in the Q&A you have other questions. What needs to be done? I've learned a lot about multi-policy over the years, also from John and at the Fed and every other places. So I like to mention that. Of course, multi-policy, in my view, is the main tool of addressing inflation. As I was reading the newspaper, I just saw this morning an article by two economists. One of them, the leader of the employer unions research institute, saying we have to run up government debt, we have to get rid of the debt brake so that we can reduce inflation. So there are new theories. Basically, a lot more government debt would help. I haven't bought into those. I think you need to raise interest rates. You need to allow real rates to rise, and that's the main way of getting inflation. At least you saw the forecast was 5% for the next 3 years. That's kind of the what you have to fight, not the 9%, but the 4 or 5%, which are now more and more embedded in the system. Okay, these are basically futures from markets, and this is comparing the ECB, the US, and UK, and you can see the ECB has done the least. I mean, we just went from 0 to 75 basis points. In the news, you will read 1.25, but that's the main refinancing rate. But basically, what determines the market right now is the deposit rate, the deposit facility rate of the ECB. So we have a long way to go, and you can see that market expectation, that's the blue dashes, is that the ECB will raise it to about 2.5% by next year. Well, that may or may not happen, but certainly if the forecast for inflation is close to 4 or 5%, as we saw in these 3-year forecasts, and you expect interest rates to rise to 2.5, short-term interest rates, there's certainly real rates are going to remain negative, at least for quite a while. So this is not really a policy which is stopping inflation. It's accommodating inflation a bit less than before. So, and even that will be hard because if they want to get the rates to 2.5 by January, that's going to be a lot of opposition as people realize that we're going to be in recession this winter. So I think the ECB is behind the curve, and it will be hard to come back in time, and core inflation is therefore likely to persist.
Mortgages in Germany floating or are they fixed price?
Most of them, I have a big mortgage, are fixed rate, and I was anyway. You can get up to 20 years fixed rates, or even more. So if you're in a fixed rate, that's good. If you have to refinance, they have risen, but still, I think I'm telling everyone, look, I mean, if where the rates are standing now, it's still a good deal. It's still a negative real rate.
Most of the rest of Europe is floating.
Some countries are floating rates. So Spain, for example, I don't know about all the countries. Maybe we had someone from Italy who, I don't know, it's in Italy. Spain is floating rate. And so, but that just means the banks are protected, but then the homeowners are hit. Right? So it doesn't really save you. I mean, it doesn't save the prevent financial system problems.
Volker, is there
Yes.
is there any observed or behind the scenes that you're aware of inter-country debate at the ECB about the course of policy? I mean, you've shown incredible variations in inflation rates.
Yeah. I mean, the ECB is looking at average inflation. I mean, that's their mandate. That's high enough. Now, all countries have someone on the board, right? The governing council actually has a representative from all the countries, including Estonia and Latvia. I don't know what they're saying now, but basically, all the decisions are taken unanimously. This last interest rate step was taken unanimously. The new instrument they have to basically manage the risk spread for Italy and other countries decided unanimously. So if you have a large committee which decides unanimously, so the president likes to have a unanimous decision, it means that there's a risk that you come too late, right? Because getting everyone on board with, as you point out, these different interests, it may be hard. So that's another institutional risk of being too late. Now, in terms of energy security, my other focus here in the talk, we have built up the gas storage, but if you compare, and this is for most of the countries here in the EU, or you can see the blue lines, or the orange is the storage level of capacity relative to capacity. So we have a lot of newspaper articles saying, fantastic, we're actually able to get over 90% storage capacity. This is looking good for most countries. But when you put it in perspective relative to consumption, which is the blue bar, you can see even if storage is full, it's only at best a quarter or a third of consumption. And as I mentioned, household consumption in the countries where you have a cold winter, such as Germany and the East, it's 85% of household consumption is in the winter. So this storage is only going to last for 2 months or 2.5 months. So we're really actively discussing whether the storage is going to be depleted in January, February, March, or April, and how much consumption has to be reduced further. So the warnings, so when we published our forecast in March, we said if there is and this is the change, John, you asked about what has changed. We basically had our forecast, and as you do, you would discuss different scenarios, and we said, look, if there is a delivery stop, you have to expect, or it's not unreasonable to think that we have double-digit inflation and recession, significant recession. Our estimates were basically 3 to 6 or 3 to 5% of GDP loss with the delivery stop. These warnings, unfortunately, have become reality. What is the reaction of governments? In Germany, as well as other EU governments, they want to encourage the reduction of the use of gas. They let prices to some extent rise. They want to also tell you how you best do it. I mean, our Minister of the Economy, Habeck, he told us it's good to shower less or cold. Cold showers are healthy. Anyway, but they also basically limit the pass-through of high prices and pay financial transfers. 1 second. To households and companies, and that has a contradictory effect on gas consumption and inflation. It may reduce inflation in the short run. That may be part of the reason France has lower inflation, because they kept earlier than us, they kept the energy prices. But of course, then people have more money to spend, and it'll raise core inflation. Your question.
Yeah, so the EU has set up this Power EU plan.
Yeah.
In response to the great energy shock. How do you expect that plan to impact energy prices and inflation? In particular, a big part of the plan is to try to build out renewables in a sort of timely fashion.
Yeah.
Do you think that's gonna make any difference?
I mean, in the long run, that can make a difference. I'll come to that. But in the short run, I think what's most relevant, I mean, we basically have this agreement, a voluntary agreement, that everyone try to reduce consumption by 15%. And that's not going to be enough. And it's really important. European cooperation is actually essential at this point, because for energy security, it's important to be able to trade electricity and gas across borders. And so a common goal of reducing consumption would be very valuable. And I think, it's kind of a glass half full, half empty at the moment. More or less, they've kept countries together, but you also have countries such as Spain, because the rivers are low, so they don't have as much hydropower. So they have been using more gas for electricity production. So it's not, but we're in Germany, as I said, 20% down. So I think that's key. And in terms of build up in the long run, I'll come to that in a second. German gas usage, I just said that. So 20% relative to the 5-year average now. I said these numbers, but we need much more. How could, in simulations, so this red point is important, simulations suggest that even with a decline of 20% in the winter, so 20% in the winter is much tougher than the 20% we have done, because households haven't saved any gas. 20% in the winter might not be enough to avoid depletion of the storage by March. It might be, it depends how cold the winter is. If the winter is warm, it's enough. So there are lots of people running simulations with energy models. And
what's the assumption about shipments from Russia coming in?
Well, the assumption there is at basically zero. The shipments from Russia are largely zero. Basically, the Nord Stream is zero. There's still a little bit coming from Russia through Ukraine and through Turkey, but it's not. It's for macro purposes, it's zero.
Sending some tanks in and winning the war now.
Right. So that's another. If you link back to the military issue at the start, one could argue, well, now that it seems that Russia is actually defeatable, which when I was talking to experts in April, everyone said Russia is going to win. I mean, the ones I talked to, I asked about. Now it looks like they're defeatable, and you might say, okay, let's just throw in all the tanks and Putin is out, and then we're going to buy the gas again. But with nuclear weapons, it's not so easy, right? So, and he has a nuclear threat, and so there has to be another kind of solution. So completely getting a regime change, I think that's out of the picture. Yeah.
That's the 64,000 question, right? Because if we're looking at it and painting a very bleak picture for what Germany is going to be facing, I think if you end up getting into winter, would there be a lot of political pressure to take the easy way out, which would be to perhaps appease Putin?
I mean, now the pipelines are destroyed. So whoever wanted to destroy them, I think, I mean, we will find out, right? Once the pipelines are emptied, they can dive down and look at what caused it. But now you can't use them.
How vulnerable is the larger? I just don't have any sense. It's possible for a determined adversary to disable.
Well, that's why I showed this picture. We're now getting. I mean, and I'm not an expert of that, but we're getting who are our significant suppliers? Norway, Netherlands, Algeria. There's a pipeline from Algeria via the Mediterranean. There's a pipeline from Norway via the North Sea, and there's one to the Eastern Europe from Norway via the Baltic. I mean, presumably you could attack those. So there are strategic considerations. I mean, something I didn't think about yet last week. Maybe somebody thought about it, was very smart, but anyway, so for the short term, all we can do is really reduce consumption, and it's feasible, but it has certainly a short-term negative impact. I mean, because as I showed you, right, we have 37% use in industry. So we got 50% of the gas from Russia. So we have to save 50%. If we get from other places 10% or so, and we have the storage full, and we shut down industry to a significant extent, and if we get gas out of electricity production to a significant extent, you can get through the winter. But then the storage is empty. So then the question is how to fill the storage next year. So maybe now the bigger problem is the winter 2023-24. So and then long term, next 4, 5, 6, 10 years, where is energy coming from at what price? Where I think that's actually what's getting me more worried than this winter. I think this winter we will just have to we will be able to heat if they are smart enough to run things, but they will have to take major users such as the chemical industry offline. No fertilizer production in Germany, for example, or no steel production, right? And they're going to complain. They're going to say, well, we cannot restart it if we turn it off now, and that may be an issue, right?
It also may mean big problems for the global economy in the sense that everything that comes from Germany, it's interrupted.
Yeah, yeah. But so you maybe going to buy a Toyota and not a.
Got a BMW on order. I'm worried about whether to do
It'll come. It'll come. It's a good choice. Anyway, so on the demand side, we can also increase energy efficiency. I mean, most of the gains in the past have been increases in energy efficiency. I'm worried. I think about the supply side. I think LNG imports cannot be a single solution. If we think about the strategic consideration, LNG from Qatar, from the Emirates, the chancellor was just in the Emirates, it's easily stopped, right? If there is a conflict, the conflict with Iran, it may be heating up. So I think, interestingly, and we didn't know this, otherwise I would have tried to get that with my colleagues in the council in March, but I didn't know this at the time. We have significant potential for own gas extraction. We have on average extractable potential 800 billion cubic meters. Russian imports per year are about 56 billion cubic meters.
What price?
Well, the world price is very high.
Okay.
The LNG price is very high. So this is actually shale gas, which has to be fracked. Yeah. But fracking in Germany would not require liquefaction. I mean, if you increase fracking in the US, you have to liquefy it and you have to transport it. Well, these are costs you don't have in Germany if you would use it in Germany.
So the fracking revolution could come to Germany.
Well, or to Europe. We have like the fourth largest resources in Europe.
Yeah.
The renewable energy expansion, as you mentioned, of course, we want to increase renewables. But that's why I showed the picture with the primary energy consumption. That's a really long-term step. So we have to build up a lot of renewables. We cannot build them up in Germany. We would need to import a lot of renewable energy anyway. You cannot build up enough wind stations, wind plants, and solar panels to replace that, right? If we move all the cars to electricity,
So the space constraint, or what is the main reason?
Well, and the cost, I mean, if you think about it, yeah, there's space, it's more densely populated. So in terms of the wind energy and the solar energy, if you put the solar in the land, this is profitable land. You can build things on it. You could have agriculture on it, right? So there are a lot of trade-offs. So in terms of solar, it would be, and then it's not very efficient, right? It would be much better to put it in the, sorry?
roofs.
Yeah, so
These are terrible places for solar.
yeah, but we can, let me come to that at the end. Yeah, I looked into that actually right now for energy security, for personal energy security issues. But the problem is that at night it doesn't shine, and so it's expensive to put in the batteries. But also it just in winter we don't have much sun.
So you have the safety of putting something on a residential. I looked into this for Palo Alto.
Yeah.
You're putting solar panels out in the desert. You put in thousands of
Yes.
them, one foot. You're putting it on top of a roof in Palo Alto that has to be insured with sprinklers and fire suppression. It's like 10 times more expensive.
Yeah, but it's going to happen. I mean, everyone I know in the neighborhood I live is looking at it, right? But we'll see. That's so it's going to happen. But what's happening now, it's interesting. So we have already a lot installed. So if you look at electricity production, basically coal is back. I mean, if the wind, this is just the electricity mix in Germany on one day in a recent week, right? September 16, 45% wind. So that was a very windy day in Germany. So we got a lot. So we have
January 16th is going to look a whole lot different.
yeah. So well,
renewables in Germany.
well, you can look on the right. I mean, even on September 21st, you can see that coal is at 44%. So basically, we have taken out. There's still some gas. You can see gas was 11%. So we're still using gas power plants, but we're using less of them, and we're trying to bring in coal to fill the gap when the wind doesn't blow or when the sun doesn't shine. This is September, so the sun is already less of an issue, right? Because we don't have enough sun. But it's highly variable, and we had planned with gas to make up for the gaps. And you see there's still nuclear, 7%. Nuclear is kind of the base supply. Now, what I'm trying to always explain is if you draw a picture, if you reduce the base and you have this volatile thing, you're going to have to do a lot more replacing, right? If you have more base supply, the dips are going to be smaller, right? They're not going to reach as low in terms of the needs. So, but anyway, we're going to turn it off probably. But coal is back. So, and now if you think forward, I mean, your question. So we're going to try to, we now have a law, we're trying to put through a law that we're not producing gasoline engines anymore, right? So if you move everything to electricity, you have to run it with electricity. So you're going to have a Tesla or a BMW. But what it effectively means, it's something like bringing the steam engine back on the road, because the electricity is going to be produced from a coal plant. So anyway, this tells you the longer challenge. Yeah.
I'm puzzled by this.
Yeah.
Coal plants need to run base load 20% of capacity all the time. What allowed them to go to close down to a point that they were 18.4% and then back to 45%?
Well, apparently it's not quite like you say. I mean, I'm not an expert, but basically now we're bringing the coal plants into reserve so that they can be supplying power. And this picture suggests it's technically feasible. That's also what the discussion in Germany is.
Efficient level of operation. You can.
Oh yes, you could run it down to 30%.
The efficient is at 90%.
Massively
Yeah.
inefficient.
But this is costly.
You could do it on a weekly basis. You can't do it on a daily basis.
It's being done on a daily basis because at night there's no solar, and if there's a windless night, and so in winter, if we have a perfect night in Germany, the snow is falling slowly, there's no wind. You want to have something, right?
It's combined cycle gas turbine.
To get electricity.
Except the gas is.
So it's going to be coal, yeah.
Is there any thought of moving vacation to February? No, seriously, vacation February and work in August when the sun is out and the wind is.
Yeah. People.
You guys have vacation days.
People are not going to be happy because you're gonna. But anyway, let me finish up when we come to more questions. I'm almost done. So I wanted to show. Here is a map of the potential for shale gas, and we actually had in 2016. We had a report from the Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources. They basically looked at that, and that's where I have the numbers from. They said fracking of shale gas. In 2016, they said that offers a way to reduce the dependence. So the experts were active. nobody knew in the broader, like people like me, we didn't know, but they were active. They looked at that. They said there is a possibility to reduce the dependence. They said what's perfectly easy to extract, or according to current technology, is quite substantial. Right? I showed you the average number of these 800 billion cubic meters. It could be much more. There were commissions created for the parliament. So we had expert commissions looking at basically the environmental impact, which is, there could be earthquakes, there could be water polluted, and there could be emissions of methane. And they basically concluded for the parliament that these can all be handled quite well, given the type of shale gas we have and given current technology. And they basically said, like the 2016 report, you should start allowing this. It's currently prohibited, and this could go forward. It will take a while to get approved, but so some people were thinking ahead. So my concluding slide, I think what we need is, and what we probably won't get, is really a signal that Germany is willing to deal with this energy security problem in a lasting way. And basically say, look, we're going to extend the nuclear power we have for another 10 years, just like Belgium did. That's climate friendly. We have already coal-based electricity production has been expanded, but right now they're saying, oh, just until April 23. That seems slightly absurd. Well, because we're not going to have gas in April 23, so it's going to have to be much longer, unfortunately. But it's very bad for the climate. We're going to have to accelerate the build-up of renewables and the infrastructure to bring the electricity from offshore wind plants down to the south where the industry is. That's a decade or 2-decade project. Building this, what I've kind of been able to find out from electricity experts. And we have to basically use other things as long as we can store renewables, such as nuclear, gas, and coal. And I think my personal point, we should really expand natural gas extraction in Germany. So I think the government right now is working on the demand side, and they're working on the let's support everyone side, but they're not working really on the supply side. That concludes my slides. So I'm ready to face additional questions.
What is the mineral rights in Germany that would be needed to extract the natural gas? And I guess if it's owned by the government, it's an obvious way to give everybody a stake in extracting that gas, which is some dividend streams they're promised.
Yeah.
But I don't. Who owns it? Is it privately owned, publicly owned?
Good question. I don't know. But basically, the key access now is the government first has to abolish the prohibition. The current politics go the other way, so it's unfortunately not very likely to happen. The current politics go the other way. Basically, it's the not in my own backyard effect. Nobody wants this to happen in its backyard, and there were movies from the U.S. About how terrible this is. I don't know.
Give them extra dividends if it's in their own backyard.
Well, but the thing is, you might be able to get the people. I mean, it's probably not a problem to get the people who own the land, right? But there's going to be demonstrations. So there's going to be a lot of opposition, and so right now, actually, all the politicians. So, for instance, this is Lower Saxony or North Rhine-Westphalia. In Lower Saxony, it's the Social Democrats. They say no. They are facing an election this fall. Just recently, the Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is on the left of this map, right, basically said, he's from the CDU, Christian Democrats, opposition. So, of course, in federal parliament, they say we have to use fracking. But the guy from North Rhine-Westphalia says we don't want this because he's afraid of the opposition. So this is, I think the pain has to be really felt. So things might change if we have if we have a day of blackouts in winter, I think or if actually unemployment rises if in the chemical industry, unemployment rises, you might get different voices. But right now, the first sign of change is, I mean, just last week, the Minister of the Economy, Habeck from the Greens, said, oh, it might be that we'll keep 2 plants running. I mean, so far they've said we shut off the nuclear plants, but we keep them in reserve, which was a nonsensical strategy because you can't use them intermittently. So, but now I think what will happen is that there are 2 plants out of 3, not the one in Lower Saxony. They're definitely gonna, I expect that they will keep them running. It's much below the potential. So you see slowly giving in if the pain it gets higher, and if you see that in the polls, they're going down. Just recently, since they said we're gonna stop nuclear power, they've gone down in the polls. So that is starting to change the thinking a bit. But I think fracking, if they had said, look, we recommended this in March, not the fracking, but in general, let's say, assume for the moment, if in March they would have said, we want to protect, we want to show Europe that they're willing to be pragmatic and use what's available. So if the nuclear power is down in France, we run our nuclear power. You know, if we want the Dutch to extract more gas, we're going to also extract gas. If they had shown that, I think it would also have had a price impact, even if it takes a while to have gas extracted. But if you say we're going to do it seriously for the next 10, 15 years, I think it really affects also, it could affect also decisions of industry or where they're locating and things like that. So that's really what I would recommend. I don't think it's going to happen, but anyway, that's my
Experience in questions in the back. Sorry.
The experience in Eastern Europe, also a good shale resource. So there was a lot of enthusiasm in the last decade for production there. There were attempts. All the U.S. multinationals went in, but did not have good results. So there's different reasons that people point to for that. It makes me a little less encouraged about the potential for a resource, just given the experience in Poland. And elsewhere. Part of it was mineral rights. They were run by the state. Slowed things down. There was environmental movement took place. Having that cheap Russian gas there, undercut, some of the economics. So it might be different today, but the experience recently has been not good.
I think there's no simple solution. There is no single solution. And all solutions are difficult. This, I think, the commissions who recommended it, they all expected that it will be several years even to get through the approval process, because to actually be able to extract something. So no, I'm not trying to say this is the solution. I mean, but it is something to be considered given the scale, and it's only the 4th largest in Europe. So there are other places, and I think yes, we're all for renewables. Everyone in Germany is for renewables. So, but it will take a long time.
That's
right.
When the system doesn't work, coal works. I mean, you could trade it.
Whoever's speaking, speak up. It's very hard to hear you.
Sorry, Michael. I'm saying when the energy systems don't balance, coal is what fixes it. Instead of having lights go out,
yeah.
Especially old plants can be brought back on. Well, nuclear plants can't be brought back. Old coal plants you can bring back.
Yeah.
You don't like it, but it happens, and just kind of hold your nose.
Well, I agree, but in terms of the climate, I mean, we basically have. I read to my. I mean, can make you feel relaxed. We have 300 years supply of lignite coal, so we can excavate all the lignite coal. It's like the worst for the climate. And interestingly, if in terms of the Green Party, the peace movement is gone. The environmental movement or the climate movement seems to be strong, but actually the strongest is the nuclear movement, because nuclear would help you with the climate. Instead, everyone is fine with running the coal plants, which is bad for the climate. But I think in the longer run, I mean, there was a good reason why Germany was betting on gas, because we understood, or at least the government understood, you need something for the transition to renewables in the long run. And gas has less emissions than oil or coal.
You're bidding on someone else's gas is the problem.
Well, as you see, we also could use our own gas, or we could buy LNG, but the own gas would be cheaper than the LNG maybe. But basically you have to use some solution. And I think it's also unrealistic in terms of nuclear power. We won't be building, I mean, there are other countries in the world which will build more nuclear power stations, but it won't happen in Germany, that's for sure. So there, it's really just an issue of keeping those 6 plants. So it's probably easier to actually get to some fracking. And even if it's just 10%, right? If it's 10% of the gas usage, it's 10%, which is totally secure also for strategic reasons. right? So I think
Volker, has the geology been done to understand the potential and cost of fracking? Because just saying you're going to frack is one thing, but you got to know where to frack and what can be accessed, how, and what the costs are.
well, this I don't want to become a preacher for fracking since I'm certainly not an expert. If I basically skimmed through this report, this is a report of a federal institute, right? This is in 2016, before the crisis. And so basically the experts looked at it, and if it would be, and what I understood from it is it's not one of the hardest to extract. So you're not talking about fracking, which would be harder than in the US. For all practical purposes, the costs shouldn't be too different from it here.
So there's a couple says.
Just a very quick comment. In Germany, nuclear is not included in renewables.
Yes.
You saw in your chart, you have renewables and then you have nuclear separate. Challenge for the Germans is industry no longer makes sense price-wise with the cost of energy. It's not merely the ambiguity of where the supply comes from.
Mm-hmm.
It's the fact that German industry has supply of energy now, but is dropping production because it's no longer cost effective to use the energy that's coming in at these prices.
Yeah.
So where is the cost effective supply that replaces the relatively cheap Russian gas in order for German manufacturing to make sense price-wise? I think that's the challenge in addition to the way you framed it, which I sign on to. And so even if you can find at the margin increase coal or do some fracking, you're still worried about the cost of all of that, especially with building out the LNG terminals, which of course is no free lunch. And so Germany is now in a tunnel. I was just in Berlin with German industry and with the chancellery, and they are, I'm worried, would be putting it very mildly, about their future. They feel that they're in big trouble now, precisely because the winter is not their problem.
Yeah.
They're already shutting some production now, having nothing to do with the winter because of the cost issues, and they don't see a relatively cheaper supply in the medium term.
This is actually a great point, because I understand some of the slide of German manufacturing before in the 2018-19 was extraordinarily high electricity prices.
Yeah.
So already you're making a lot of manufacturing moving out of Germany, and it's just going to keep moving out of Germany.
I mean, but the thing you have to keep in mind all along, I mean, so as I was on the council, the problem was never, we didn't talk about Russian gas, but we did write one report after the other on climate policy. And so the thinking all along in the last, in energy, and industry has more or less signed on to that. The thinking was, yes, we are going by 2035 and 2050 to an economy which is more and more based on renewables. And this requires higher costs, and basically some of the high energy intensive is going to go away, or we have to find agreements.
It's going to move abroad, which is like the climate chaos.
Yeah.
Where you
So in a sense, it's not coming out of the blue, except we thought, the government thought, the industry thought, well, this is a 20-year process. Yes. Right? It's a 20-year process. And now we have a very high price. So on the one side, you could say, well, be happy. Now the incentive to incentive to invest in renewables is fantastic. The incentive to basically switch to hydrogen or to ammonia, you import renewable, produced with solar power from the desert, and we ship it in. Then we use the pipelines, the LNG pipelines to ship hydrogen or ammonia or whatever. I think you could say, well, the incentives are great, but the incentives are so great, it's a major shock. And the question now is, yes, you can shut down production of the energy intensive chemical products. That saves a lot, and so that gets you through the winter, maybe through the next one. That production will be moving elsewhere anyway. So I think BASF is not building its fertilizer plant in Germany anymore, even though all that was invented in Germany. They're building it in Canada or in the US. But the main question, and you raised it with the energy prices, I think if we have now for a long time energy prices without having a bridging technology, right? A lot more companies are switching and moving production elsewhere. So I have here the newspaper from when I was flying over. Handelsblatt had an article with lots of companies talking about the new plants they're opening in Tennessee, in Oklahoma, in BMW, Bosch and others, West Virginia, yeah. So not in California, it's too expensive, but so that's happening. And I had a meeting in Berlin, just with some people who are owners of the medium-sized companies. They are very important in Germany. There are many medium-sized companies which are in exports, in engineering. And their response was a little different from the chemical industry. They said, well, we have had problems for a long time. There's tremendous uncertainty. We've learned to adjust. We are adjusting. Of course, the big ones are complaining, but we are adjusting. But of course, how are they going to adjust? And that's a problem. If these engineering-related products, if they say, oh, I'm going to move part of my production to the US or industry or Canada, I think these are high value added products. And so that's what makes me worried. You know, where is the growth, the potential growth in the next 10 years supposed to come from?
So it's just a question back here.
Could you talk, you mentioned a little bit about like the leaks and like the pipeline being destroyed or whatever. Is that like a big concern for the winter? Or like, does that mean that like even if Russia wanted to appease Putin, like is there any point like send gas to the pipeline?
I think, what I've just read from the news is the pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline, they have to wait until it's empty. So all the gas in there is going to flow out, and then they would have to dive in 6 meters and repair them. So I'm no expert, but I think it's pretty clear that's not going to be an option for the winter. Yeah, so I said that initially. So there are some other pipelines. You know, there are pipelines via Ukraine. There are a few land-based pipelines, and they could be used more. He has also reduced supplies on some of them. But personally, I think that's off the table anyway, the appeasement option. And we're gonna get through the winter with a lot of hardship, but I think the main concern is the medium-term option. And even though I think the German economy or industry was presumably prepared for expensive energy, the question in international competitiveness is also, okay, is it more expensive than Asia? Right? Because eventually it goes to the same level as Asia. If the world supply of LNG goes up, everyone pays the LNG price. But so with fracking in Europe, it doesn't have to be in Germany. It could be in other places in Europe. You could undercut that. So if you would want to have gas at a lower price, well, then you have to have own production. And my guess is many countries are going to look at that, probably also in Asia.
Is the U.S. doing anything?
Well, you must know more about the U.S. here, but the incentives to increase fracking are there. Of course, I don't know. There may be limits to expanding the liquefaction facility Sorry?
They banned the Keystone Pipeline, they banned the West Virginia Pipeline, that we're not big on fracking anymore.
Okay, so I think you will have to pay a lot of money. So prices have to be very high to induce countries to do more.
Yeah. So the thing that worries me most about your talk is the inflationary side. The Fed just beginning, the ECB just beginning, who else just beginning, and then way behind these numbers. Yeah, 9.1%, and still less than half, 3/4, I guess. So something has to give. Now, and it's more complicated because you've got the war, and you've got the gas things, which you'd like to be able to deal with this in a reasonable way that doesn't affect the economy. But it seems to me the gas situation and the war, we don't know where the war is going. It seems to be these huge uncertainties. I don't know if it's a way that you can have a plan that's contingent on either.
Yeah. Not just uncertainties. So we kind of know where things are going to go. we're into the next crisis, which is going to be involved massive amounts of fiscal and monetary stimulus. You're gonna be printing up more money and handing it out to people to pay their gas bills. And so good luck to the ECB. And the ECB doesn't dare raise interest rates because then Italy goes bankrupt.
Yeah,
Fragmentation.
you have to call in an
Exactly.
ECB you have to call in an ECB speaker who then tells you exactly why you're wrong. I'm not going to say that.
Let's talk the outlook.
I think yes.
Massive fiscal expansion through the winter and the crisis, and the ECB knows if it raises interest rates, then at least somebody's got to refinance the Italian debt. So that could be more fiscal expansion, or it could be,
Well, can you make a recommendation to the ECB?
Well, yes. So my recommendation, which I've been making since last year, is to raise interest rates. They should have, of course, done it earlier. They would have been in a much better position now. Sticking it, and for the government, the recommendation is yes, support those people who are low income, that they can get through the winter. So actually, that's not that hard to arrange that, but don't support everyone, because ultimately you need to get households to save too. Otherwise, if you don't get households to save, then you basically will have to shut down a lot of industry over the winter, and they may not restart. Right? They may rather say, okay, fine. They are going to complain. They're going to say to the government, you have to send us money. It's exactly happening. And there are a lot of people who say, well, in the pandemic, it worked. We do it again. But the pandemic was a very different type of recession. Right? So this is a high price for a lasting period. This is not a government-induced stop production and then we're back to normal. So yes, my recommendation is to resist that. And so I think in Germany, the finance ministry, the way the coalition works, I mean, the promise of the finance ministry is to stay within this debt brake next year. So they are fighting a rearguard battle to actually not have a massive expansion. Yes, some expansion. You have to do something, otherwise you lose the majority. Right? You don't want to have too many people on the streets. But I think there is a good chance we're not going to have a massive fiscal expansion in Germany. Because importantly, it doesn't help, right? Digital money, you create digital money and it doesn't help you heat, right? It helps people pay, so they ask more, demand more, so gas prices will rise more. Or it basically, they will spend it on other things, so core inflation will be more persistent. And you may have the question on the ECB. I think the ECB needs to raise interest rates. But I wish them good. I met one member of recently, and I said, I wish you very good luck, because it's really, really tough now. I mean, now you saw these numbers in the recession. So the voices which are going to say, stop, going to be very loud. So basically, I'm skeptical they're even going to make the 2.5% markets expect by next year. I mean, they might. They're still committed, but actually preventing a sustained raise in core inflation, it's going to be hard, but inflation will come down. Headline inflation will come down because we're probably close to energy prices peaking later this year, right? So once they have peaked, it will come down. And that, I mean, this is my closing thought to your question. If we look back at the 70s, right? In 73, we had the Yom Kippur War. We had the oil embargo, so war embargo, just like now, except the US was differently affected because it was oil, and the US didn't have shale oil and shale gas. And you can see here, 74 here in the middle, interest rates and inflation, and you see interest rates rose along with inflation. It's not like Burns didn't allow interest rates to rise, but it wasn't the Taylor principle. Right? It's not like real rates. It kind of followed inflation. And then when the recession was there, they let interest rates decline. And it looked like a fantastic move because shortly afterwards, inflation was coming down. But inflation came down to 5% and not further. And then it rose again. And so I think this is the danger for Europe now. And maybe the US has a better chance to avoid that, given how determined the Fed seems to be now. But that's the challenge, right? To basically stick through keeping interest rates high when inflation is coming down. Because
your chart of the ECB's interest rate, inflation rate is almost like the US.
So I think if you, in terms of prediction.
Not like this, Max. It's like the current, which is much shorter. We just had a year and a half of inflation. ECB is a little bit less, but it's so different than this.
In different in what sense?
This is 12 years of rising inflation.
No, but let's just look at 1973. Right, 1973 is in the middle here. So in the middle, you have inflation of 5% in 73. In 74, you have inflation of 10%. Right, the green line rises by 75. It's above 10%. So it's a very short process. So in terms of
so long, it's 12 years. 10,
But it did,
15
his
years.
point is it did come down in 76.
no, my point is in 76 it came down. So if you look in the middle, the spike in the middle, I can't paint on this right now, but if you, I'm gonna get sorry for that. But if you look at this part, right? In 73, it was at 5%, even below 5%, right? The green was at 3%. Then it rose to 10%. This is within the course of a year.
It had the end of wage and price control somewhere in there too.
Well, wage and price control is another thing we're discussing.
Well, yeah, remember, in late 72, we imposed wage and price controls. That kept inflation down.
But maybe it's hard to tell this story
We
in
should
1 minute.
superimpose the current situation.
Yes.
It looks so fast. It's not going, and you've got to stop.
The superimposition is going to be for my next talk. That's the great suggestion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great.